In this episode of the How to Do Your 20s podcast, I have Danny here, and we're going to be talking about diet, nutrition for performance, and also some entrepreneurship, as always. So I'm really excited about this. So, first off, Danny, thank you for coming on the show.
Travis, thanks so much for having me on. Honored to be on, and hopefully we can get some good information out to people.
That's always the hope, and I'm sure it will. Let's start off first. Your story. How did you get involved in nutrition, in all this kind of stuff?
Cool. So I'll try and keep it relatively brief, but I think the kind of main cliff notes was when I went away to university. I originally started studying biology and physics, so starting to really learn how to dive into science as part of my course. But as my main hobbies at the time were all athletically based, playing different sports, was doing a bit in the gym, used to play quite a bit of soccer, and did some MMA and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu when I got into college. So they were my main hobbies. And really, to try and improve my own performance, I started to looking at, well, how can I learn things to try and improve that? And because at the same time I was learning how to read academic research papers, I started to look at sports nutrition and exercise physiology research really as a kind of nerdy hobby in my own time, separate to my studies. And so at that time I started to learn some things that were probably different to, I think, a lot of the mainstream messages people may get around nutrition, or at least gave me a new perspective away what actually a good quality diet for an athlete probably is. And so that really sparked my interest. So after university, I ended up going and teaching biology and physics in a high school here for a year. But really, I kept getting drawn back to this whole nutrition and performance side to me. And it was really what I was doing in my own time as a hobby, like I say. So I started to think, well, I really started to realize at that time that maybe the school system wasn't set up to be something that I was really set out for. And I think having that kind of I really love the teaching aspect of it, but not so much the kind of structure and having to stick to the set kind of routines and syllabus, etc. And so probably starting to get those first kind of inklings of entrepreneurship and wanting to go my own way, and just basically said, well, I'm doing all this stuff as a hobby in my own time. What if I were to make a business out of this, make a lifestyle based around this? And so I took the decision after that year to go back to college, got my master's in nutritional sciences, and then from there just kept trying to learn as much as I could, and eventually ended up setting up Sigma Nutrition, which is a company that really puts out evidence-based information around nutrition and performance. So like I was chatting with you off air, we have kind of two main components. One would be our coaching service, all online, and then we also do more educational stuff of trying to help people with their nutrition via podcast, primarily, also video content, and then live speaking gigs. So that's really how it came about, and from there it just kind of developed more and more over time.
Perfect. And we're going to dive in deeper to the entrepreneurial journey later in the show, but let's start off with some good nutrition advice. So I guess my first question for you would be, what are some of the biggest mistakes? And let me actually clarify first. Your nutrition is specifically geared towards athletes, people looking for better performance, not so much in the weight loss. Am I correct in that?
So yeah, we cater for people who are doing that, but they primarily have some basis in training. So they're doing some strength training, but a lot of our clients would be maybe geared more towards general fat loss and doing that from a health perspective. So we have a number of coaches working with us now who will work with those types of people. Myself, my main coaching right now is with professional MMA and boxers primarily, but a lot of our coaching team would work with general population. Yeah.
Perfect. That's let's stick with the more high end performance stuff because that's something I'm
Cool.
personally very interested in. What Let's talk about a diet. Like so someone comes to you and they say, "Hey, I want to train." And we'll start with the more amateur. I want to train for an MMA fight. I got 3, 6 months, whatever it is. What does their diet look like?
So yeah, in terms of some of the big mistakes I suppose a lot of athletes in general tend to make is maybe not making that distinction between fueling themselves for performance as opposed to a fat loss diet they may have seen somewhere online. And so typically a lot of them tend to be under eating, especially if they have a fight coming up and they have to make weight for it. You tend to see a lot of them on very low intake of calories, and sure, that will help bring the weight down, but it's maybe not at a level that's going to sustain good quality training performance. Kind of tied into that is again probably a message that has been taken a lot from the kind of weight loss industry, is thinking they need to lower the amount of carbohydrate in the diet to effectively lose body fat. And so they end up losing out on performance there because their diet is probably lower in carbohydrate than it need to be. And so they'll do typical things like, I've got a fight coming up, so I need to lean out, so I'll take white rice out and I'll take pasta out and take potatoes out of my diet and just stick to lean meat and broccoli, right? And they end up being massively under fuel on carbohydrate and calories. So that's particularly from like a high-end athletic standpoint of view, some of the main mistakes. And I think a lot of it comes around of thinking that specific food choices and sticking to like good foods or clean foods is the more important thing, instead of forgetting the bigger picture of really overall calorie intake and macronutrient intake. So protein, carbohydrates, and fats are going to be much more important for an athlete, especially those ones who have these really high energy expenditures over the course of the day. So the specific food choices don't matter as much as maybe some of them think. And sure, we want to make sure most of the diet is on good quality food, but a lot of people go on thinking that if they just stick to these specific foods and ban everything else, that's going to be their best option, where really getting their overall energy intake and their overall macronutrient intake is probably more important for those high-end athletes.
You know, it kind of reminds me, I don't know if it was as big you're in Ireland, right? I
Right,
think. I don't know if
right,
it was as big in Ireland as it was in the US, but when Michael Phelps was winning all the gold medals, they showed like what his diet looked like. And it was
right.
not the healthiest thing I've ever seen, but it was just he
Mm,
needed so many calories that it didn't matter. Like he'd have
right.
the pancakes and the syrup and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's just so true, and we see this especially with our fighters. And a really good example comes in after they've made weight and weighed in. They then have that kind of like 24 hours between the weigh-in and the fight. So right then they need to fuel back up on carbohydrates and get as much glycogen back into their muscle as possible. Now, some of these guys end up having like carbohydrate intakes that could be 800 grams of carbohydrate in that 24 hours, which is a huge amount. And so if you try and do that from just bananas and oats, you're going to really start, it's going to be nearly impossible, right? So if we get them something that's more kind of processed, and sure, maybe in the long term it's not as good, but at that time point it's useful. And I think it brings up the good idea of there's always a context to different things. So sure, we're not saying everyone should be eating 800 grams of carbs from processed foods, but maybe on this one specific day for a high-end athlete with this specific goal, then it's different. So yeah, we see this all the time. There was actually a research study done looking at cyclists where they depleted them of their glycogen stores and gave them two different types of meals in a 4-hour window. So after they did a long ride, deplete their glycogen, then they were going to have a recovery period where they would have two separate large meals. And then 4 hours later, they were going to do another time trial on the bike. And they wanted to compare the groups to see, number one, was there any difference in their actual performance on the bike in the second instance? And also, was there any difference in how quickly they got their glycogen levels back up? So what they kind of did was typically put down what people would think you'd associate with sports nutrition, right? So they got Gatorade, and they got Cliff bars and protein bars and recovery gels, all stuff you see in like high-end sports nutrition supplement companies will tell athletes they need. And they compared that, and they just took another set of meals that had the exact same amount of calories, exact same amount of macronutrients, but all of it was from McDonald's. And so when they actually did the study, they found that there was no differences in performance and no difference in glycogen restoration between those groups. So again, showing that, yes, to some degree, depending on someone's context, obviously food quality matters, but in a specific instance for an athlete, the main thing is still the overall energy they take in, and are they getting enough protein and carbohydrate, for example.
That's crazy to me. Just as someone, I don't eat a lot of McDonald's, but when I do, I don't feel like cycling afterwards. I mean, so but
Right.
there was no difference in performance.
Yeah, so they had a 4 hour window after that meal before the next bike ride, so a bit of time to digest it. But yes, there was no difference compared to what like supplement companies would tell you you need for optimal recovery and performance, in terms of all these different types of intakes once the macronutrient intake was matched. So it was more of a kind of just a fun study to see. It's certainly nothing that I would base someone's diet on, but
Sure.
it was just more of a fun thing to get people to start thinking, okay, we don't always have to distinguish specifically for an athlete what a good diet is based on these foods versus these foods, and saying you can never have these ones and you must always eat just green vegetables and lean meat and that's it.
Absolutely. So another question for I think maybe we go with the professional athlete, then maybe the amateur athlete, and then maybe down to the average regular person. But what would
Cool.
a daily intake of food look like for a more professional style athlete? Like, let's breakfast, lunch, dinner. Like, what are they eating, kind of thing?
Cool. Yeah. So for our professional MMA guys, I think a big consideration with them, if we're looking at, say, a block of time where maybe they don't have a fight coming up or they don't have to be dieting down, the main focus is then just on performance and recovery. So giving them enough, like I said, calories, enough carbohydrate for those sessions, and then adequate proteins throughout the day. So what it generally ends up looking like is the morning time, the first meal will probably like to get in a decent amount of protein at each of their main meals. So this is somewhere between maybe 20 to 40 grams. So for people not looking at specific numbers, you can think of 20 to 40 grams is probably going to be in a normal serving of, say, chicken or beef, or maybe 3 to 4 eggs, or maybe some Greek yogurt or a scoop of protein. So something like that will be in there. So depending on what their morning training session looks like, they'll probably also have some carbohydrate. So a sample meal could be some oatmeal with a scoop of protein and maybe a handful of nuts. Then they could go and train. If it was a particularly hard session and then they have another one later on, they may have some fast-acting carbohydrate after that session. So a supplement or maybe a Gatorade with, again, maybe a scoop of protein. Lunch, again, will probably be a meal where we focus on a good quality protein source. So maybe a piece of turkey or chicken or fish with some amount of vegetables that the athlete likes. And then depending again on their day's training, a good quality carbohydrate source. And the portion is kind of tailored to the size of the athlete and what training they have. So it could be some rice or some whole grain pasta or some potatoes or sweet potato. Same thing after the evening session, depending on what type of training it was, they'll have some protein and carbohydrate afterwards. And then for snacks, it could be anything that will get them up to level of macronutrients that we're looking for. So maybe they have something like some rice cakes and peanut butter. Maybe they have some Greek yogurt with some fresh berries and some nuts, something like that. But really, once they're getting that distribution of protein throughout the day and enough carbohydrate to fuel their training, we kind of base it towards the individual then.
So I think you said you do some jujitsu as well, right? Yeah.
Right. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I do jujitsu as well, so I'm trying to think, is this the kind of, is it change for me? Obviously, I'm not a professional. I assume you're not a professional
No.
MMA person. Okay, so do you do that, you follow the same kind of diet, or do you make any changes to yours?
So when I was doing a lot of jujitsu, again, the main thing was based on training frequency and intensity. So there would be periods of times in the past where I've done two, sometimes 3 sessions a day if I wasn't working, to times where I may be training 4 times per week. So if it's a day where someone's just training once per day, which I think is the vast majority of us, right? We'll train maybe 4 or 5 times a week. For a lot of people, sometimes a lot less. Let's say someone's training each evening. Then again, once they've got sufficient carbohydrate over the course of, say, the 24 hours between those sessions, they don't need to necessarily fuel up or have a big carb load before they go and have a training session, which I think, again, is maybe a common misconception. Guys will think, okay, 2 hours before I go and roll, I need to have this massive bowl of pasta. And then suddenly they feel bloated, and then they're wondering when they're on the mats why they feel terrible, instead of realizing that they, as long as they're getting a decent amount between those 2 sessions, they're probably fine. And so the intake could look something similar to that. The biggest difference obviously is just going to be how much overall energy they need. So if they're training less and doing less training sessions, if they're the same size as, say, our other example person, they're going to need less calories overall. So probably a good base to look at is just tracking something as simple as body weight, which particularly for anyone competing in jiu-jitsu is probably most useful because they're going to have to weigh in for a competition. And so just tracking that will give them a good idea. Are they taking in enough calories overall? If their weight is starting to drop steadily over time, they're probably under fueling unless they're trying to lose weight. And if it's starting to gradually increase, they're probably just taking in too much for that as well. So that they would be a couple of the main things. The other big thing I would say is after a training session, making sure to get a decent amount of protein. So that could be a protein shake, but it also could be, like we say, a meal with a decent serving of chicken or beef or something like that within the window of time after a training session is going to be particularly useful, just for muscle repair and recovery. So the food choices won't specifically change from athlete to athlete. It's more about the overall intake and how much is going to change just based on their needs.
So if someone is, and you've kind of mentioned this, I just want to, I guess, get a little bit clearer. If someone is trying to, let's say, cut down weight, does that impact the number of carbohydrates they're eating, or how does that change?
Right. So again, yeah, if we're taking the example of before, someone has this very steady body weight, they're just fueling enough to stay at the body weight and perform. Now they want to start maybe bringing down their body fat levels over time. The biggest thing for athletes who want to maintain a decent level of performance is to make sure that they're dieting not too aggressively. So the weight loss should be fairly gradual and a rate of maybe like a pound per week as a good steady rate of weight loss. For some people, maybe even a bit less, particularly if they're in their lower weight classes or they're very lean already. If someone has a lot more body fat and is at the kind of heavier weight classes, they can probably get away with maybe dieting 2 pounds a week and having no real detriment to performance. But a kind of good starting point for most of us is about look at to lose about a pound per week of your body weight. That means that you're under eating, but just slightly, that it's not too aggressive that you're going to start seeing massive detriment to your performance. So that's the biggest thing, just kind of tailoring your portion sizes gradually, and your overall intake of energy just downwards. In terms of carbohydrate, I would actually think that people don't necessarily have to worry about taking carbohydrates down for that weight loss or that fat loss. It's not the carbohydrates that's going to stop someone or cause someone to say gain or lose body fat. It's still the overall amount of calories. But what we do want to do is keep protein intake very high. So we don't want to be dropping protein intake. So if we're dropping calories, we have to decrease it from somewhere. So that could be from decreasing some amount of dietary fat. It could be decreasing some amount of carbohydrate in the diet, or a combination of two. Usually it's going to be some combination where just portion sizes get smaller. But in an ideal world, I'd still like the athlete to try and keep their carbohydrates as high as they possibly can whilst still decreasing body weight, if that makes sense. So a number of things can be done. We've had athletes make some simple changes. Simply in the mornings, they would usually have, like we say, so maybe some oats with some protein and a handful of nuts. They might take out that handful of nuts. That will maybe knock off 200 calories out their diet. They'll stop using peanut butter in their shakes later on in the day and instead just use some low-fat milk and some protein and some, say, some fruit. And so they're just doing small changes that will overall decrease the amount of calories, while still trying to get enough carbohydrate in the diet to perform well. Does that answer the question?
Absolutely.
Oh,
So I'm
cool.
curious to hear your thoughts on, I see one of the diets that's trending, and it seems to be both for performance and just like general fat loss, is the ketogenic diet. And I have a feeling you're not going to be a huge fan, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so I think the thing with the ketogenic diet is there's some, again, it all comes back to context, right? There's some applications that are actually really cool. And like in research, we're seeing some fascinating areas of combining, say, a ketogenic diet with some form of calorie restriction and something called hyperbaric oxygen therapy for cancer patients. We know for years and years that ketogenic diets you will prescribe to a child who has epilepsy and it stops their seizure. So it's not to say
Okay.
that it's completely out of context, but for a sporting consideration, because you don't have the provision of carbohydrate and you then therefore don't have those glycogen stores, the athlete can't work at high intensities for long enough. So for any sport that requires that, particularly something like MMA, or jiu-jitsu, where you're working at quite a high intensity, you don't have the ability to generate energy quick enough, and so your body will have to automatically drop back and work at a lower intensity because you don't have carbohydrates available. And so if there was any sport where a ketogenic diet may be beneficial for performance, it could be something like an ultra marathon or an Ironman, right? Because sure, it's really tough, but your body is moving at a low enough intensity. Just because the race takes you 10 hours, you can't sprint the whole thing. You have to work at a low enough intensity that you can generate energy fast enough purely from burning fat and ketones. You can't do that if you're scrambling in a wrestling position, or you're doing a sparring session, or you're trying to do jujitsu. And I think anecdotally, I pull this back because I've trialed some of this stuff when I used to be rolling quite frequently. And one, I think that a lot of guys that are on the mats will maybe maybe resonate with if they've tried low carbohydrate or ketogenic diets is, sure, you can actually last the duration of the training sessions pretty well. And that doesn't seem to be an issue at all. You can go the whole session and stay working, but it's when you really need to kick into a higher gear that it's just not there. So there's suddenly a scramble, and there's no kind of power. There's no, for guys that are doing MMA, there's no real kind of snap there. There's no at those real high intensities, things start to break down. So yeah, for something like that, um, MMA, jiu-jitsu, any field sports, really you're going to be at a disadvantage by using a ketogenic diet. And yeah, where we are with sports nutrition research right now still kind of backs that idea up that um, to perform at your best, you want carbohydrates in your friend. The more interesting thing, which we can maybe discuss, is that doesn't necessarily mean that any athlete needs to have a high carbohydrate intake every single day. You can periodize them, and you can use low carbohydrate days, for example, and training sessions where you have less carbohydrate. But for the training sessions or for the event when you want to perform at your best, that's when you want plenty of carbs. But then maybe there's other stress sessions or recovery sessions or rest days that you can have low carbohydrate intake. So I think it's not about high or low, it's about using carbohydrates in an intelligent way.
Another thing that I saw you did some research on, and correct me if I'm wrong, was vitamin D. And
Mm.
is that still something that you, especially being, in Ireland, I'm sure it's not as many. I'm in Santa Monica,
Right.
California here. So
You're lucky.
yeah, what's the role in vitamin D? And is that still something that's big in your nutrition coaching?
Yeah, so vitamin D research is really, really fascinating. So, like you said, my master's degree, the research thesis was based around looking at vitamin D levels throughout a population and how they would change based on different interventions. So, if we were to start to fortifying these main foods that lots of people eat, like milk and bread, by this much, what would it do to that curve of overall intake? Or if we gave everyone this amount of a supplement, what would it do? So that was the basis of the research. But on an individual level, we know it's super important for so many processes in the body. It's one of the very few um, compounds that we have receptors in every cell of our body. So no matter what type of cell it is and what organ, there's a receptor on that cell for vitamin D, which indicates immediately how important it is. And like you say, our main source of it is getting it from sunlight. And so if you're in a place where there's plenty of sun for most of the year and you're outside regularly, then you probably don't have an issue. But for us over here in Northern Europe, for example, we have maybe 6 months a year where there's not sufficient sunlight to get good quality vitamin D. And even on top of that, during the summertime, with people's sedentary lives these days, you have a lot of people who maybe get up in the morning, go to work in an office, they're inside all day, and by the time they come out in the evening, it's actually no longer bright. So it can be a huge issue. And there's a number, like, really just we've seen research linking with so many different things, both health wise. We're starting to see it in relation to sports as well, that can affect maybe muscle function. We know things like bone, it has a big role in. And so, yeah, it's one of those ones where probably one of the few things where a supplement for a lot of people is probably a pretty good option, particularly during the winter months.
So it sounds like the takeaway message is get your vitamin, or if you're in the UK, vitamin D in
Mhm.
for sure.
Yeah,
Let's jump into what, and we can come back to all this stuff, but let's jump into some of the entrepreneurial stuff because that's
cool. Yeah.
absolutely fascinating for me. So you
Mm.
said you were doing teaching for a little while, and then what was the transition period between teaching and now obviously you have your own successful coaching business.
Mm.
How did that
Sure.
happen?
Yeah, so after I decided to leave teaching, like I said, I went and did a master's degree, which took me about 18 months to do. And I suppose during the second half of that, I was kind of thinking through what I wanted to do come the end of it. I knew it wanted to be something nutrition related, but trying to really piece together what would be. And the more and more I started to think about it, of what I would want from how I was essentially going to make my living and my career progressed, more of the stuff related to entrepreneurship started to pop up. And I started to really, I suppose, get more in tune with my own skill sets and preferences. And I think that's a really important thing for anyone, just to realize what's actually important to them. And so things for me that started popping up was, not only did I want that kind of freedom to do something myself, but things like that I could base myself wherever I wanted at any one given time, that I could move to different places if I wanted to, that I wasn't tied down to certain things, that my schedule was free enough that if something popped up that was going to be cool to me in the future, I'd be able to say, okay, I can do that and just move something around. And a lot of that actually came about from, and people have different opinions on this, but I ended up reading Tim Ferriss's The 4 Hour Work Week originally, and
Yeah.
Tim Ferriss is one of my favorite. I just like Tim Ferriss. I've probably read everything that he's put out, and I know some people might not be their cup of tea, but I think there was a lot of messages within the 4 Hour Work Week that really resonated with me, that were probably outside of the real practical stuff that he had in there. I think the first for, and I've said this to a number of people before, even if you've no interest in creating a startup or going into business, reading those first kind of like 3 to 4 chapters, I think there's so many like real pearls of wisdom in there of just like how you want to live your life that
Sure.
really influenced me big time. Things like using excitement as a better word to chase or to go after than happiness, right? Or just the idea of setting up things based on your own schedule and being geographically independent. And so when I started to do that, I was like, okay, I need to do something myself, and starting piecing together a business plan. And there was actually in the college I was in, they were associated with a local incubator that would take on 10 startups per year and would have them with office space, and they'd work together and do workshops, etc. And so I decided to apply for this, not really knowing if this is the way I'd go, not even really expecting that I would get onto the incubator program. Ended up bringing my pitch for my business plan, went through some of my ideas, came out of there not really thinking much of it, and then heard maybe a month or two later that I'd been accepted onto the program. And so that was a 9-month incubator program, which was extremely helpful in just getting me more in tune with the kind of back end stuff of business and being able to run that, and just understanding more of the kind of things that I wasn't as good at, because I wasn't coming from a formal business background. Right? I'd never done any business or marketing in college, anything like that. So that, and plus the kind of connections it gave me was pretty useful. And so during all this time, of course, I was developing the website. I was continuing to coach people. I had started when I was in college, and building that up, working with people, trying to learn as much as I could about different clients, what actually works in the real world, building up my experience, going to more courses and seminars and learning all this stuff. And then when I got onto the incubator, I started developing the website. And I think probably one of the big things, which we can maybe dive into, that I kind of really focused on early on was not being in a rush to really drive revenue early on and to really push my initial kind of product. It was more about, okay, how do I put out really good content first that people are actually going to find useful? And
Sure.
then maybe just being already comfortable with the idea of playing that bit of a longer game. And so I started the podcast in April 2014, started writing articles, started trying to help as many people as I could. And so I think it was somewhere between 18 months to 2 years since the website had gone live before it ever first became like something you could actually buy on there. And I think that's not something to say that's the optimal way to go. I think it was probably a bit too long, and I think a number of people have done things way more successfully. But I think it's just a good reminder to people that to have a bit of patience with stuff as well, because I think that's often where people go down. They give up a bit too early, or feel that they're not really thinking of the long game. So that's how it all kind of came about. But if there's any specifics to dive into, I'd be happy to discuss them.
Let's start with the incubator. So do they take a percentage, or what was the benefit to them?
No, so this was actually they had funding from the local university, as well as they were tied in with some of the state-funded bodies that were trying to drive more entrepreneurship in the country. And so they didn't take any percentage or equity of the company, which was kind of one of the big draws. The difference being they obviously didn't give as large an investment initially, or initial cash injection, as other incubators. They give us a smaller one, but they didn't take any equity, with more of the idea of just trying to drive more entrepreneurship within the country. And so, yeah, that worked out pretty well for me in the end.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
absolutely awesome. And
So
so in the meantime, from starting it, you said it took about 18 months to 2 years. to start getting any kind of revenue from it. How are you making money? How are you supporting yourself?
Yes. Oh, so I should kind of clarify. Within that time, I was still coaching people, which is where I was making most of my money. So nutritional coaching, both in person, physical locations, and that online. And then for any of the business kind of outlay that we had, there was obviously, like I say, some money coming in from the incubator to pay some of those costs. And then plus between that and just money I'd really saved from that year that I was teaching in school, it was really kind of using that money with the kind of idea, okay, I'm going to get to a point where if it
Right.
runs out, I'll be in a position to actually make some money. So it was 18 months in when I first started promoting stuff for people to kind of go and buy this on the website and sign up for these seminars, et cetera, et cetera. Here's online coaching. Whereas before that point, it was more just people around me that I'd stayed coaching.
Was there any big spikes in your audience and like your like anything in particular that comes to mind, I guess?
Yeah, so it's almost like a hockey stick shaped curve in that it started kind of very gradually, and then maybe I would say between 6 to 8 months in, there started to be a slight upturn. And in that every month, but before that, numbers have been slightly growing. But I think around that like 7 to 8 month mark, there started to be quite significant jumps month to month. And once that happened, then everything started to kind of snowball. And I
Wow.
think just that organic growth really kicked in because at that point numbers were big enough where the show is consistently in like top podcasts in Ireland and the UK on iTunes, so people were organically finding it there. More people were finding out word of mouth. As the show grew, it became easier to get bigger guests who'd already heard about the show on, and it kind of just really started to snowball. And so I think that was kind of the tipping point of where it just really started to escalate and get big numbers. But yeah, there was certainly that first kind of 6 months was a very slow, gradual climb, and there was certainly no like massive spike out the gate or anything like that. It was that slow, gradual climb, and then you could start to see it kind of ticking up and up, and yeah.
If for some reason your podcast was deleted, the blog was deleted, and everyone just forgot who you were overnight, and you had to like restart from scratch, what would you do differently this time around?
That's a really good question. To be honest, I think I would maybe not try and be as perfectionist as I was with a lot of stuff. I think maybe perhaps one of the reasons why took so long to put stuff out onto the website, and especially with some of my early kind of marketing was actually pretty poor just for the fact of not wanting to push things at all. I think having been able to get stuff out to the world when it was maybe like 85% as good as I would like it to be. That would have been sufficient to help a lot of people. And I think a lot of times I've been crippled by this kind of perfectionist thing of making small little changes that maybe people wouldn't even know. So only until like maybe 6 to 7 months ago, I was still editing every single podcast I put out, spending a couple of hours every week, like really fine tuning every detail of how it sounded. And sure, the sound was good, but the question I had to ask was, what if I could get someone to do it nearly as good, maybe not to my like super sonic supposed hearing that was all in my
Mhm.
head, but that the few hours that would save me. And so I would do that stuff way quicker. I would bring in more people to help, and I would stop being as slow to put stuff out because I was scared that it wasn't perfect. So that was definitely something I would change.
I fully agree with that. Even with this podcast, there was actually a period of time where I stopped recording episodes because it was just I have my own business that's like this is more almost a for fun thing for me. Like I'm not even trying to monetize this, so I
Right,
have other things that are actually making me money. And then I realized, okay, well, instead of spending like you said a few hours editing it, why don't I just do some basic stuff? Or now I've trained my VA to do it. So I'm like,
right.
you just take care of everything. Totally with you there.
Yeah, it makes such a difference. And yeah, I was a
What
fool.
about that's a common thing though. It's that perfectionist.
Mm,
It's the old phrase. I think what is it like? Perfect is the enemy of great or of good, or perfect's the enemy
right.
of done, or something like that. As far as marketing, how do you get new people to your? Is it so? Does most of the traffic come to the podcast or to the blog at this point?
The podcast is still probably our biggest draw. It has the probably the loyalist following as well. In that there's a lot of people that will subscribe and stay listening, and it's definitely been a big driver for us. And we've seen it in a lot of our application forms for coaching that a significant percentage would have came from just being longtime listeners of the podcast.
Sure.
Um, so the podcast is probably our still our number one maybe driver of people first finding us, right? And then from there they may delve into some of the articles we have or some of our social media content, etc., or get something on the email list. But I would say a significant percentage is probably that are kind of first come across us via the podcast for sure.
And so how do you get new listeners to the podcast other than obviously just producing good content?
Yeah, there has been no overly complex marketing strategy, and I think this is probably something on our behalf that we could probably do quite a lot better. We've done almost little to none like Facebook ads. We've done some now and again more to drive certain kind of conferences that we'll sell per year, but nothing really in the way of the podcast itself. And a lot of it has been purely from just organic growth. And I think one of the good things about that focus on just putting out good content is once it's at the level it's at now, like I said, it's consistently sitting pretty high in the iTunes store. So anyone that is going searching for a podcast related to nutrition and health will typically come across this and they will see it. And so that's been our real biggest driver, that and typical word of mouth. So it's probably an area that we could do a lot more, and I certainly know there's powerful ways to get a lot more to it. But right now, we're still trying to grow the coaching system in a way that I would like to have it much more systematized, and a lot more materials available to our coaches, so that we're really kind of standardized across the way we're working with clients and the materials we're giving. And I think that there's a lot of work there to do. And so for me, the focus is on getting that stuff really nailed down before trying to expand that service further with more people and more coaches. And generally, that's a byproduct then of being able to drive more people to our content in the first place. So there's been a huge amount of it just has been organic, and so I'd love to say there was a really cool, complex marketing funnel behind it that I was the brainchild behind, but I'm neither that smart or up to things at the moment. But yeah, that's the way it's gone.
No, that's perfect. So I have one last question for you, and this is more of an overarching question. It doesn't have to do with fitness or entrepreneurship. You can interpret it however you want, but it's general advice. So if you could tell just some general advice for people in their 20s, what kind of advice would you offer?
Yeah, I think sometimes I'm hesitant to give people advice, but I think I'm much more comfortable doing it to that demographic you say of people in their 20s, especially for anyone who doesn't have any major commitments right now in terms of they don't have like a full family at home with a mortgage or etc. Like, sure, if you have those considerations, that's something that I don't have to deal with now. So I can't really feel comfortable giving someone in that position advice. But for anyone else that doesn't, I think it's just such like it's the biggest worry I see most people making is that they need to they're worried about whatever decision they make to do now, or worried to make the risk to go and do something because what if it doesn't work out? Then this time would have been wasted, or I need to start making money now, or I need to start doing this thing now. And really, people underestimate just how much time they have, especially if
Mm,
you're in your 20s. And if there's like, this is the only time you'll get to do something, and whatever kind of crazy idea you might have, or something that you think would be cool to do for a living, this is your only chance to do it, right? In general, I think it's going to be a lot more difficult when you're in your mid 50s and you've got a family and a home and a mortgage, etc., to say, okay, I'm moving across the world to start a vlog in Thailand, right? You're just probably not going to do that. So I think people underestimate how much time they have. And I think one thing that with me as well that has been um, trying to find this idea of, because people always hear, oh, you should do what you love and kind of follow your passion. I think it's a good word, but it's become a bit cliched. And I think that gives people the false idea that if you're doing what you love, then every minute of every day is just like this happy bliss. And it's not, right? That's not the thing of doing what you love. And a quote I heard from Casey Neistat, who's a New York City videographer, really big YouTube channel. He said that the kind of quantification of success isn't so much doing what you love, or basing it on how much time of the day you're doing what you love. It's on how little time you're spending doing what you absolutely hate. And I think that's a better way for people to do it. So if you are spending most of your day doing something right now that you absolutely despise, and the situation you're in you absolutely despise, and do something to change it. And there's ways to do it now. And so that's all I can say to people. I don't know the specifics of their context, but now is the best time that you'll ever get to do it. And really, if it doesn't work out, it's probably not as big a deal as you would think. And like I mentioned with Tim Ferriss earlier, there's a really good exercise in the 4-Hour Work Week where he does that, like visualize your worst case scenario if you try doing this thing. And if it doesn't work out, like what would happen to you? And then what are the steps you need to take to get back to your baseline? So where you are right now. And when you do that, you pretty much see that number one, the worst case scenario might not be as bad as you think. Number two, even if it is, you can probably get back to where you are now within, say, 6 months, right? So say you lose all your money and your business doesn't work out, whatever. What if you spent 6 months just crashing on your parents' couch, saving up money, working a couple of jobs? You'd probably get back to where you were in like 6 months, so it's not that big a deal. And they're just some things that kind of just pop to mind, and I'm sure there's so many other ideas off the back of that, but they're just things that kind of resonated with me at least.
No, that's great advice. Danny, where can people find out more about you, listen to the podcast, all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, cool. So if they're looking for the podcast, just go into iTunes or whatever podcast app they use and just search for Sigma Nutrition Radio. You can find everything else over on the website, which is just sigmanutrition.com. And then if people are looking for social media, I'm on Instagram. Just go Danny Lennon _Sigma Nutrition. Facebook, just search for Sigma Nutrition. And then I'm on Twitter and Nutrition Danny, all these other places. I'm probably pretty easy to find, but the website will probably tell you all those places anyway.
Perfect. Danny, thank you so much for coming on the show.
No, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed that video, and if you did, make sure you hit the big red subscribe button down below. You can also check me out on Facebook and on Twitter, and I release a new video every Monday, and by hitting that subscribe button, you'll get those new videos every Monday. And this is really a podcast. It's also a website. You can check out the website. It's howtodoyour20s.com. I'll put a link right over here as well. And what it's all about is trying to improve your life. And we specifically focus on things that people in their 20s are interested in. So make sure you like the video if you liked it. Subscribe, like us on Facebook and Twitter, whatever. But I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you again on another video.